Hello and good evening. My name is Dan Gifford, and I'm a member of the Filson's Board of Directors, and we are so glad to have you joining us this evening, both personally and virtually, for tonight's lecture. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsor, the Olmsted Parks Conservancy. And once again, thank you for joining us virtually and in person for Frederick Law Olmsted, bringing nature to the city and creating breathing space for democracy, featuring Laurence Cotton. Laurence Cotton, currently based in Portland, Oregon, a city that benefits from an Olmsted master plan park system, originally hails from Boston, renowned for its Olmsted landscapes and the home base of generations of landscape design practitioners working for the Olmsted Brothers firm. A practicing public historian and writer-producer of historical films for PBS, Mr. Cotton was trained as a cultural anthropologist. He had a rather famous classmate you might have heard of named Ken Burns. They worked on projects together, took classes together. One went into film studies, one went into cultural anthropology. The rest, as they say, is history. And that cultural anthropologist degree helps bring a lens to bear on much of his work. He has worked with tribal populations throughout the Columbia River watershed and has also worked on open space acquisition and the designs of parks and trails in the Pacific Northwest. At the end of the lecture, I'll return to moderate for just a couple questions at the end if we have time. And for that, we'll make sure to please use microphones for those that are joining virtually, and those that are doing so can also use the chat feature. So with all of that in mind, please join me in welcoming Laurence Cotton.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Dan. I want to make sure that my technology is also cooperating. It's good to know that there are so many people with us today who are clearly interested in the name Olmsted, both those in the room here at the Filson Historical Society and those in the virtual realm. It's truly an honor to present to an audience here today at this distinguished historical society. I'm an active member of two in Oregon and Washington State. How wonderful it is to be spending a couple of days here in Louisville, one of my favorite towns, I have you know. In fact, this is the third time that I visited here with regards to the Olmsted legacy. I want to extend my thanks to everyone associated with the Filson Historical Society, including particularly Scott Scarborough, who's put so much effort into the planning of this event. And also, I wanted to extend my special thanks to everyone associated with the Olmsted Parks Conservancy, in particular, Executive Director Leila George, with whom I've had a long outstanding friendship and collegialship, is that the right word, in the Olmsted arena. And it's truly a pleasure, and thank you for all of your support through these years. And the Olmsted Parks Conservancy, what an incredible organization that has done such wonderful work for the city of Louisville, for its Olmsted parks and its park system in general. Now, before I go any further, indeed, April 26, 2022 marked the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted. Communities across the U.S., in fact, were readying for this past spring and in effect the entire calendar year of 2022 to commemorate the legacy of all the Olmsteds, the father, the two sons, and the Olmsted Brothers landscape architecture firm. My plan is this today. I will review Olmsted's life. It's going to be a fast-paced program, folks. I've got a lot of slides for you, and at times I'll be speaking quite fast. I will review Olmsted's life and career. Then we will explore the Olmsted legacy across North America, including Senior, as I will refer to him, and the two sons and the Olmsted Brothers firm. Then we will spend a little bit more time focusing on the Olmsted landscape legacy broadly in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys and in the Midwest, if you will. Plus, we will dip down into the Southeast for a little bit. And I will say right up front, I'm not a specialist on the Olmsted parks here. Sure, I know them. I've spent some time here. I had a wonderful tour again with Leila just this afternoon. Thank you, Leila. But I don't pretend to be a specialist on the Olmsted parks of Louisville. I will eventually talk about them just a little bit at the end of the program. Allow me to introduce, or reintroduce, if you will, the man of the year. Not the man of the hour, the man of the year, the man of the century, the man of 2 centuries, Frederick Law Olmsted. Here is a colorful description of the man by his friend, George Templeton Strong, a well-known public figure and diarist of the day. This is from Templeton Strong's diary. Quote, "He is an extraordinary fellow, Decidedly the most remarkable specimen of human nature with whom I've ever been brought into close relationship. Talent and energy the most rare. Absolute purity and disinterestedness, prominent defects, a monomania for system and organization. He works like a dog all day and sits up nearly all night, doesn't go home to his family for 5 days together, works with steady, feverish intensity until 4 a.m, sleeps on a sofa in his clothes, and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles. Now, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, I have been known to breakfast on strong coffee at 6 or 7 a.m, but strong pickles at that hour do not appeal. Well, here is Frederick himself reminiscing on his boyhood. I was very active, imaginative, inventive, impulsive, enterprising, trustful, and heedless, a troublesome and mischievous boy. I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really, for the most part, given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler on the shallowest shores of the deep sea of the natural sciences. Well, that mischievous boy turned vagabond certainly eventually made something of his life, did he not? I hope you come away from today's program with a more enhanced feel for this man and what made him tick, and the legacy that he and his sons bequeathed to our nation. Central Park, Brooklyn's Prospect Park, Boston's Emerald Necklace, the White City of the Chicago World's Fair, the park systems of Buffalo. Here's Delaware Park in Buffalo, an entire park system. In Louisville, Cherokee Park in Louisville, an entire park system. More about that a little later. Legacy parks in Chicago. Here's the Japanese Garden inside Jackson Park in Chicago. Belle Isle in Detroit. What a jewel of a city island in the lake. The Olmsted Linear Park in the Druid Hills neighborhood of Atlanta. The Biltmore Estate, of course, we cannot forget. In Washington, D.C., the U.S. Capitol grounds. The green suburb of Riverside, Illinois, one of the first intentionally designed green garden suburbs in the United States, all master planned by Olmsted Sr. Mount Royal Park in Montreal, as they would pronounce it up there. There is the prospect from the park overlooking the city of Montreal in dusk. The Niagara Falls State Reservation on the New York side of the waterfall complex. Those are just a handful of the more celebrated masterful landscapes designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. But if you add in the park designs and landscapes carried out by his two sons and the Olmsted Brothers firm, the imprint across the geography of North America is simply astounding. 700 parks and 6,000 commissions in the life of the Olmsted Brothers firm, which was active in Boston, Massachusetts until the 1970s. I want to share a few items from media coverage in the past several years. We have a very literate audience with us tonight. No doubt, some of you perhaps occasionally read the New York Review of Books. There was an article a few years ago titled America's Grain Giant. That was the title of the article by scholar Martin Filler, including discussion of new volumes by and about Frederick Law Olmsted, including this collection of essays, which I commend to you. After initially calling attention to the acclaim that has been received by the Heinlein Linear Park along Manhattan's West Side, scholar Filler writes this, quote, "Yet however much the High Line has enriched the post-millennial megalopolis, its social effects pale in comparison to the revolutionary vision of the public park as promulgated by its greatest American exponent, the 19th century polymath, Frederick Law Olmsted." Well, I expect some of you read this about a year and a half ago now in the pages of the New York Times, a moving essay by Michiko Kakutani, who in fact is an avid bird watcher. The heading of this particular piece of hers was Finding Refuge in a Snowy Owl in Central Park. And this is but an extract of a longer piece. I have to start with a beautiful wintertime image of Central Park. Quote, "Central Park has long provided a refuge for the anxieties and stresses of daily life, perhaps never more so than during the time of the coronavirus. New Yorkers who visited the park every day, as well as those who have long taken it for granted, felt a renewed love for this amazing rectangle of green in the heart of the big city. Its startlingly lush woodlands and rolling lawns, its meandering trails and wide open meadows, and of course, its astonishing wildlife, including owls. Here is the very snowy owl, including owls, hawks, herons, and a dizzying array of other birds who for generations have used Central Park as a vital rest stop in their migratory travels, knowing what many humans only came to fully appreciate during the uncertainties of the pandemic, that the park is a beautiful and essential sanctuary," unquote. And if I had written that, I would have bolded and underlined the word essential. essential sanctuary. It's not an extra, and our parks are not extra amenities that we just take for granted. They are essential to our very lives and our democracy, I put it to you, and that certainly would be Olmsted's point of view. Just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to this film project, when I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents, very near Boston's Franklin Park. As an adult, I would walk along Olmsted's Back Bay Fens and the Fenway to visit the famous museums of the area, the Museum of Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I would jog around Jamaica Pond and botanize and stroll around the Olmsted-designed Harvard Arnold Arboretum. All of those parks are integrated into Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, a crescent of Olmsted-designed parks and parkways that run around a major portion of the city of Boston to this day, of course. I would also visit Central Park and eventually come across Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And the first time I entered through the Endale Arch that you see before you and looked down the expanse of the Long Meadow in Prospect Park, tears welled up in my eyes as I was simply overwhelmed by its sheer beauty and utter perfection. This was decades before the notion of making a film about Frederick Law Olmsted was a glimmer in my eye, if you know what I mean. By the way, I learned very shortly after, well, I expect some of our audience today here in this room and in the virtual realm perhaps saw our nationally broadcast PBS film. It's had several airings nationally and regionally. Perhaps you saw it subsequently on pbs.org where it's available. It's also on Amazon Prime, by the way. But I learned very shortly after moving to Portland, Oregon, some 28 years ago, that the park system there was master planned by another Olmsted, the stepson named John Charles. I began to say, there's a research avenue I need to pursue here. What about this stepson who I didn't really know much about at the time? And what about his legacy? And what about his younger brother, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.? And what about the grand man himself? Time to dig down and read the biographies, meet some scholars, interview current landscape design practitioners to really get a full handle on this extraordinary family's design philosophy and their legacy. Well, I did so. Eventually, I reached a friend back east, Laurence Cotton, a well-known environmental filmmaker, a co-founder of Florentine Films with Ken Burns. And I said to Larry, let's collaborate again, and let's produce a film for public television. Well, it took us 7 years, as these films usually do, by the way. But finally, we did produce this film that did air nationwide, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America. Now, since that time, I've continued to dig down yet further. I've become very active nationally with the National Association for Olmsted Parks, attending scholarly symposia, et cetera, continuing to visit sites, including private estates that are not normally open to the public, revisiting some of my very favorite places, such as Louisville and its park system, and digging yet further into the archival literature. So allow me in the time that remains to share some of my gleanings with you from of these many years of work in the Olmsted arena. Rather than reviewing Olmsted's entire career at this program, what I want to simply do is launch him on his career trajectory and hint at some of the stops along the curvilinear path, if you will, that caused him to become America's great park maker. His early years in brief. Frederick Law Olmsted's life began in 1822 as the first son of successful merchant John Olmsted of Hartford, Connecticut, Hartford born. As a youth, Olmsted roamed his native Connecticut landscape in his father's saddle on horseback through the New England countryside in silent, contemplative, reverie-filled trips of exploring and experiencing wholeheartedly, in a full multi-sensual sense, the New England countryside. Young Frederick attended several boarding schools in Connecticut, but he had to abandon plans for college due to weak eyesight. However, he briefly worked for a New York City dry goods importing firm, but the young man was captured by the romance of life at sea. And in 1843, he set out for China as an apprentice seaman, sailing to China and back. In fact, it was a rather harrowing experience in his year before the mast. He barely got out of it with his life. Now, young Olmsted did attend lectures at Yale, including one on the subject of scientific agriculture. Another one of his favorites was chemistry. But he didn't matriculate. He wasn't enrolled. It was his younger brother, John Hall Olmsted, who was enrolled at Yale. Frederick basically audited his brother's classes, but he did hang out with a group of Yaleys during this time who remained profoundly influential. In particular, here's John Hall Olmsted, here's Frederick Law, and look at that, his right arm is around the shoulder of this very intent-looking fellow looking straight at us. That's Charles Loring Brace. He would go on to found the Children's Aid Society and become one of the leading social reformers of late 19th century America. And he remained a lifelong friend and deep influence on Olmsted's thinking and his career path, I'll have you know. Now, In 1846, Olmsted began to explore a career, in fact, as a scientific farmer, a field that was on the rise. He apprenticed first at a model farm near Syracuse, New York, then with his father's financial assistance. He always required his father's financial assistance early on. He bought a property on the Connecticut shore, which didn't work out real well. He gave it up in short order. It didn't prove suitable for farming. But then he bought a larger property on Staten Island, Tosamoke Farm. Here's Olmsted's, down below is Olmsted's own sketch. Up above is a mid-20th century photograph. There, he moved a lot of dirt. He moved a lot of dirt. He planted a lot of trees. He even grew vegetables for the farmers markets. He made some improvements to the farmhouse and the outlying structures. And he was very proud of this place. Now, you might wonder, is this, and by the way, some of the early notable parts of his career really began right here. But is this place still here? You might be wondering. Yes, it does. This is what it looks like now. It's the Olmsted Beale House. A nonprofit organization has recently secured its listing on the New York State Register of Historic Places. And look at its state. Oh boy. Well, they're busy raising funds for full restoration as accurately and as authentically as possible. The exterior, the interior, and the garden. And it will be open for historic home tours at a date uncertain. So keep posted. But that's what it looks like. That's the Beale House. Now, in 1850, Frederick travels to Europe and the British Isles in the company of his brother, John Hull Olmsted, and his best friend, Charles Loring Brace. Also in 1850, he's hired by the New York Times to tour the South and file reports from the field. More about those two chapters in a few minutes. In 1855, Olmsted becomes partner in the firm that publishes the popular Putnam's Monthly magazine. This is the 1855 edition. However, that business fails in 1857. But that same year, Olmsted's first book about the South, not his first book published, but his first book about the South coming out of his reporting for the New York Times, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, is published to some considerable acclaim. 1857 is a momentous year in Olmsted's life. He is appointed first superintendent of the Central Park. That's what it was referred to as the Central Park. And it is after that that he and English-born architect Calvert Vaux collaborate on this, the famous winning design for the park called Greensward. And with that success, Olmsted is appointed architect-in-chief for Central Park. This is the image that many of us have of him, looking very debonair with his cape and his hat as architect-in-chief for the park. And in 1859, Frederick marries Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, his brother's widow. There's a moving moment in our film, if I don't mind saying so, where we hear the brother's letter from Europe when he's dying of tuberculosis. He says, I'm paraphrasing, "Dear brother, please take care of Mary and the kids when I'm gone." Frederick dutifully complies. He does marry his widow, Mary Cleveland, and formally adopts her children, raising them as his own. In 1861, Olmsted is appointed General Secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a Civil War-era national medical relief effort securing an aid and supplies for wounded soldiers. More about that in a few minutes. I'm returning on some items that I'm going to return to shortly and expand upon. After resigning his appointment with the Sanitary Commission, Olmsted is appointed Commissioner of the Yosemite and Mariposa mining estates. Who knew Frederick Law Olmsted was managing a gold mine in the Sierra Nevada? He moves his entire family to the Sierra Nevada. There they are, picnicking up front on horseback in the Mariposa Grove, Frederick and Mary. And here he is, this is the roughneck frontier town of Mariposa, California, circa 1860. But while there, he's appointed to a California State Commission, and he plays a leadership role in writing the first report proposing the permanent protection of Yosemite Valley before John Muir became involved with this little effort. More about that a little later in this program, too. In 1865, Olmsted is reappointed landscape architect for Central Park, and with Calvert Vaux, he begins work on Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Here is Calvert Vaux on the left. There's by the way, their design for Prospect Park among Olmsted scholars and landscape architects is as significant as is the Greensward plan for Central Park, I'll have you know. And on Broadway in Manhattan, Olmsted and Vaux opened the first office of landscape architecture practice in the US, thus launching a unique career. Now, over the course of his life, Olmsted Sr., as I will continue to refer to him, experienced considerable family tragedy. Early deaths of mother, brother, and 2 children. His own near death in a terrible carriage accident in Central Park that left him maimed for life and was plagued by a nearly lifelong struggle with dark depression. Facing these and a host of other physical ailments toward the end of his career, fighting infirmities and utter exhaustion. He was still designing the landscape for the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago and the grounds of the Biltmore Estate, and supervising the creation of these, his final masterpieces, as was detailed so well in that popular book, The Devil in the White City, that some of you certainly know. Then, after years of waning physical and mental health, he tragically lost his mind. Olmsted passed away in 1903 at the McLean Asylum on the outskirts of Boston, an institution the very grounds of which he had designed. What a story, what a life. Now let's review certain aspects of that career. Perhaps we should say careers, right? His manifold roles of scientific farmer, social reformer, capable administrator, writer, editor, and literary publisher, landscape designer, and last but certainly not least, master park builder. Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was first and foremost a social reformer, and his career was central to the social reform movement in the US during the second half of the 19th century. He was a philosopher of democracy. He read widely and deeply and wrote thoughtfully about this subject. And by the way, he had planned a manifesto on civilization. Never quite got it together to prepare such a volume. But he manifested his philosophy of democracy in his park design and in his actual park creations. This is what Olmsted had to say about Central Park. And while we listen to a couple of his, okay, there we go. Did you know that Sheep Meadow was closed during the height of COVID? Sheep Meadow in Central Park was closed during the height of COVID. It only reopened to the public in spring of 2021. So while you enjoy this picture of Sheep Meadow, this is what Olmsted had to say about Central Park. Two quotes for you. It is one great purpose of the park to supply to hundreds of thousands of tired workers who have no opportunity to spend the summers in the country inexpensively what a month or two in the White Mountains or the Adirondacks is at great cost to those in easier circumstances. He wanted everyone to have a Walden Pond experience, a White Mountain, an Adirondack, a Catskill experience right there in New York, easier and far less costly to actually have that experience right there, right? Quote, another one, here's another one. In Central Park, you will find all classes largely represented with a common purpose, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. You often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old. As one of our commentators, historian Keith Morgan, said, Olmsted intensely believed in democracy and the park as a site for the enactment of democracy. In fact, one could argue, and by the way, there's recent scholarship that has totally underlined this fact. One could argue that Central Park was Olmsted's response to what he witnessed in the South prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, and that this great park would provide a counterpoint as a welcoming democratic space where anyone could gather, regardless of origin or background, and that the park itself would help point a way to the future of the nation, healing post-Civil War. Though he just strayed away from describing himself as such, he was indeed an artist. As is stated by historian Sarah Cedar Miller, Central Park was arguably the most important piece of American art in the 19th century. Clearly, it was the most monumental in scale. Author and Olmsted expert Elizabeth Barlow Rogers had this to say about Central Park in our film. Quote, it is a triumph of 19th century engineering, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. How perfect is that? You have symphonic sequences of beautiful spaces in the Olmsted Parks here in Louisville as well. Now, why do I have this picture? The Oxbow by Thomas Cole. Most people know it as the Oxbow, unless I'm mistaken, the official title is After a Thunderstorm. Of course, Thomas Cole is often pointed to as the founding painter of the Hudson River School. This, to me, is not just a generic painting of the Hudson River School. Ken Burns and I attended college 3 miles north of here. I lived in a farmhouse 2 miles north of here. I've hiked to the top of Mount Holyoke many times. That's an Oxbow on the Connecticut River. To me, it's an intimate site that I know very well. So what the Hudson River School painters were doing in 2 dimensions with pigment and brush on canvas, Olmsted, and initially with his key collaborator, Calvert Vaux, was painting, drawing, and sculpting the landscapes of America's great cities, not in 2, not in 3, but in 4 dimensions. What's the 4th dimension he was involved with here, anyone? Time, I heard it, time. In Olmsted's own words, I have all my life been considering distant effects and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. In laying out Central Park, we determined to think of no results to be realized in less than 40 years. By the way, you don't have to read too much of Olmsted, and his writings were voluminous, nor spend that much time in his masterworks to realize his vision wasn't just 40 years ahead. His vision was 100 or 200 years into the future. He was that much of a visionary and forward-looking, brilliant artist and thinker. Now, I don't have time to do a deep dive into landscape design theory or landscape history today. Let me simply say that as a landscape designer, Olmsted clearly was influenced by those who came before him, practitioners of garden design and deep thinkers in the realm of art, such as John Ruskin. Particularly, though, I want to give credit, if you will, here to the great English landscape designers Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton, who were, in essence, Olmsted's antecedents in England, the English naturalistic gardening tradition. But also we have to give a nod here in America to Andrew Jackson Downing, who was so influential in mid-19th century America up to the time of his premature death. Now, I also want to offer a shorthand. If you read even Thomas Cole, if you read Olmsted, if you read the Romantic writers and thinkers of the area, including the British poets, you often hear references to the sublime, to the pastoral, to the picturesque. It's hard to create the sublime in an urban setting. What was the sublime? Well, in Europe, it was the Alps and the crags of the English Lake District. In the US, of course, it was the White Mountains, the Adirondacks, the Catskills, and Niagara Falls. You can't recreate the sublime in a city, but you can certainly, with a lot of earth moving and some careful design and plantings, you can certainly create the pastoral and the picturesque. So rather than describing it 2 words, I'm just going to demonstrate. Here's the sheep meadow. Big, wide open, sunlit meadow, fringed with trees, great place for people to gather in numbers if they so choose. This happens to be the north end of the sheep meadow. Only a quarter mile from the north end of the sheep meadow, the pastoral, leads you into the ramble. Let's get it going. There it is, the ramble. Look at that. The birding hotspot for Central Park, as some of you know. Curvilinear paths, an enclosed woodland, a burbling stream or water feature nearby. Great place for solitude, individual communion with nature, or maybe a place to be with a loved one, if you know what I mean. Very intimate place. What a difference. And all of the great Olmsted masterworks have that transition, often multiple times over, if it's a large park, between the pastoral and the picturesque and back and forth. So there's the demonstration of that at work. Now, as builder of Central Park, Olmsted successfully managed thousands of men in one of the largest construction projects to that point in time in America. During the Civil War, as director of the Sanitary Commission, by the way, the forerunner to the Red Cross, Olmsted perfected his management skills while heading up a huge supply, medical relief, and field hospital operation that including managing a veritable flotilla of hospital ships from the Chesapeake to the Mississippi. Here is a USSC hospital ship on the Mississippi. And during this period, Olmsted reorganized the entire Army Medical Corps and coordinated contributions and volunteers from local aid societies. In fact, given what we've just lived through these last several years, it's interesting to note that up until that point in time in American history, the Sanitary Commission was the largest public health initiative at that moment in time. And sanitary fairs were held in the major cities of the North. Here is one in Philadelphia. And many of the women's leaders of the era were involved with raising funds for the Sanitary Commission through these fairs. Here is one such, Catherine Prescott Wormley. She was a nurse in the field. She worked right along Frederick Law Olmsted, attending to the wounded in the aftermath of 2 of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, Antietam and Gettysburg. There is the Sanitary Commission Hospital set up in Gettysburg. They were there right in the aftermath of those 2 very bloody battles. Now, by the way, a whole program could be done on just this one interlude in Olmsted's life, even though it was only a couple of years when he was directing the Sanitary Commission. His early writings. Olmsted published his first publication, in fact, was a travelogue and a reflective series of essays in this, Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. This is the original, and you too can buy this edition on the right. Wonderful. It was at that point, particularly while exploring the English countryside, that Olmsted was working out what overarching landscape design concepts he thought best to apply to American soil. And by doing so, to enhance the public park experience for everyone, not just the wealthy elite, as it was up until that time. In fact, Olmsted was particularly inspired by England's very first public park, Birkenhead Park, designed by Joseph Paxton just across the waterway from Liverpool, the first publicly financed park in England. And he was inspired not just by that fact, but by the design elements that he admitted he liberally borrowed some of those design elements, Americanized them. if I can coin a term, Olmstedize them and place them right into the greensward plan that he collaborated with Calvert Vaux on for Central Park. Now, on another front, the literary republic, Olmsted wrote 3 volumes about the South through the slave states, through the plains, and through frontier Texas. And they had a lasting impact. They're still in print, by the way. The later version of this, consolidated into a single volume with a new editorial tone by Olmsted, finally came out as the Cotton Kingdom. I do recommend a version of it that might have the introduction by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. It's still available today. He also published a map of the Cotton Kingdom to go along with this book. And by the way, there's wonderful new scholarship that Layla knows about that is being conducted by several scholars, including an African-American scholar who's doing brilliant work on this. She also happens to be a landscape designer and landscape historian. So what a combination. Now, his career, by the way, his journalistic career, in the very early phase of the New York Times, when it was called the New York Daily Times, he was hired as a roaming correspondent in what seemed to be a foreign land as far as the Northerners were involved, the antebellum South. From the Northern perspective, the Deep South seemed to be a foreign land. And when his first book was published in England, it had a huge impact on intelligentsia, and it's documented that it helped sway British public opinion away from supporting the Confederacy and toward the Union side at the outset of the Civil War. It had that much influence in England, the Cotton Kingdom. It really did. And by the way, he did a very deep economic analysis of the institution of slavery and what might now be deemed politically incorrect and inappropriate language. He did capture in vivid detail the life conditions of enslaved people. And actually, some people would say that beyond slave narratives, no one at that time captured the real life conditions of enslaved people as Olmsted did at that time. They are vivid, let me tell you. Now, and it was cited subsequently by none other than Charles Darwin as influential in his thinking about race as he was preparing The Origin of Species for publication. Not only that, in the early 20th century, it left its mark on the young Malcolm X, in prison, hungrily reading and feeding his mind as he was maturing in his political thought. Olmsted's writings on the South still are echoing around the world, folks. In addition to his stint as a publisher and co-editor for Putnam's Monthly, Olmsted co-founded The Nation magazine and played a key role as editor of that publication in its very early years. He co-founded it and he edited it. And during this relatively brief period in his career, Olmsted befriended and edited and published some of the most prominent writers of the day and intellects of the day, members of the American literary Renaissance, unquestionably, to name a few. I hope you recognize at least 2 or 3 of these. That's why I don't have names here, but that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. Olmsted was profoundly influenced by Emerson's essay on nature. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville, Harriet Beecher Stowe. They were part of his circle, his literary circle, his social circle. And in addition to that, Olmsted had contact with several key painters of the second generation of the Hudson River School, including his distant cousin from Hartford, Frederick Edward Church. This is obviously not Church. That's his famous canvas of Niagara Falls. There's a reason why I show that. Well, I could go on, but you get the point. Between Putnam's Monthly and The Nation, and through his social circle and his ties to the cultural leadership, his contacts were a veritable who's who of the arts and letters of America during this era. And to that list can be added many of the leading social reformers of the day, particularly those in New York City and New England. Now, one note, we did try to give some credit in our film to Calvert Vaux, Olmsted's partner, a man who brought Olmsted into the actual design of Central Park, also convinced Olmsted to return to the business of park building when Prospect Park became available. Poor Vaux, the sometimes lesser known partner, at least to the general public, but a great architect in his own right, yet a man that time seems to have passed over. This was the era when the whole notion of the parks as the lungs of the city began to take hold. That the notion that parks would create refuges of fresh air. And park advocates argued that parks provided refined imitations of nature, claiming that exposure to them would improve people's character, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Architect and landscape designer Andrew Jackson Downing wrote this in 1848. Listen to it. I think it stands the test of time. Parks will be better preachers of temperance than temperance societies, better refiners of national manners than dancing schools, and better promoters of general good feeling than any lectures on the philosophy of happiness. What do you think? I think that stands the test of time. Well, sentiments like that reflected the influence of the Romantics on the New World's attitudes towards nature. What had been seen as previously as something separate from humans to be conquered and feared became something humans could return to for restoration. Downing and Olmsted on separate trips brought their experiences of touring European gardens to the US, further emphasizing the beneficial relationship between humans and nature and democratizing the public park experience for everyone. Before Central Park, there was but one place urban New Yorkers could go to recreate, and it wasn't the working class. It was the bucolic lanes, shady, beautiful bucolic lanes of Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. By the way, it's still there. I recommend it. It's not far from Prospect Park. But it wasn't the hardworking New Yorkers who were going there. It was well-heeled gentry, if you will. After church on a Sunday morning, they would show up in their Sunday finest to take carriage rides and to perambulate on the shady lanes of Greenwood Cemetery. Olmsted was adamant that Central Park would serve everyone, regardless of skin color, family origin, or economic status. I should emphasize, by the way, that parks were absolutely seen as instruments for public health. In fact, more than once, Olmsted even then referred to Central Park as a public health institution. Go figure. New York and all cities, by the way, back then were still dealing with outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. In fact, Frederick Law and Mary Olmsted lost their first child due to an outbreak of cholera in New York City. In their arguments supporting the design for Central Park, Olmsted and his collaborator Vaux wrote this in 1868. Bear with me, it's a little bit of a longer fragment. There is no doubt that let's give you another picture of greensward. There is no doubt that the intense intellectual activity which prevails equally in the library, the workshop, and the counting room makes tranquilizing recreation more essential to continued health and strength. Civilized men are growing more and more subject to insidious enemies to their health and happiness. And against these, the remedy cannot be found in medicine or in athletic recreations, but only in sunlight. And such form of gentle exercise are calculated to equalize the circulation and relieve the brain, unquote. Now, there's somewhat archaic language there. You may not entirely agree with their case for active, I should say passive versus active recreation. After all, times and sentiments have changed in that regard. But, you know, I like this fragment because it does remind me that perhaps along with Henry David Thoreau, Olmsted and Vaux in this passage were among the earliest proponents for forest bathing, a concept that is much in vogue in the time, the modern version of which comes to us from Japan. And by the way, I have to wonder, a little bit of an aside, folks, I wonder what Olmsted and Vaux, in particular Henry David Thoreau, maybe you could add John Muir to this list, would think if he saw people roaming in public parks today, county parks, city parks, state parks, and heaven forfend, national parks, with protuberances jutting out of their ears, listening to their own unique soundtrack, oblivious of the sounds of the natural world, or even worse, like this trio on a park bench, entranced by their shimmering screens. Now, they may be solving the problems of the world, but you know what they're doing. They're watching their social media feeds, and they're oblivious, completely oblivious of the natural world surrounding them. And by the way, I point the finger at myself. I'm pointing it at all of us, but also that includes myself. Now, enough silliness, okay? Now, our film zooms in on the stories of Central Park, Prospect Park, Buffalo, and Boston's Emerald Necklace. A few comments about those projects before I move on to other members of the family and other sites. By the way, Olmsted and Vaux considered Prospect Park their masterpiece. As for one, they weren't hemmed in by a rectangular area as they were at Central Park. They didn't encounter nearly the same level of political or fiscal interference, which we detail at length in our film, as they did at Central Park. Nor did they need to make as many compromises with their original designs. So they considered it their masterpiece, I'll have you know. It's worth visiting. Speaking of which, I don't think I have a slide here, but the first time I entered Endale Arch, it was a dank, dark tunnel. And it remained that way until just a couple of years ago. I wish I had, there's meant to be a before and after picture. It's disappeared. But boy, the Prospect Park Alliance, working with the Parks Department, has done an extraordinary restoration of the Endale Arch. You got to see it with its zebra wood paneling. It's just extraordinary, just as Olmsted and Vaux had originally planned it and designed it. It's a wonderful restoration. If you go to Brooklyn, through the go to the Grand Army Plaza entrance and walk through the Endale Arch today into the Long Meadow. What an experience, folks. Now, I do have some information I'd like to share with you about this. My hometown, Boston. There it is, the original Olmsted 1887 plan for the Back Bay fence that predated, that was the early project that predated the actual Emerald Necklace, by the way. But when he tackled this product, it was the transformation of a tidal basin that was in essence part of the public sewers of the city of Boston. Here is another overlay from the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. And this project can be pointed to as the first true wetland restoration project in the history of America, I'll have you know. I talk about many of my delightful discoveries in the making of this film. In fact, one was Buffalo. I hadn't been to Buffalo since I was before doing research for the film. I hadn't been to Buffalo since I was 6 years old. I had a vague memory of a family trip in the country squire all the way from the suburbs of Boston to Chicago. The one vivid memory I had was Niagara Falls. That's about it. No memory of Buffalo, but boy, what a city. By the way, Buffalo and Louisville have some interesting comparisons, and Buffalo is another one of my favorite Olmsted Park cities, but what a park system there. There's the original Olmsted design. The first time an integrated park system as such ever, even the idea of it came out of his head. The first time it was ever designed and built in America. Look at that. These are all parkways. And there are hubs. The hubs are the traffic circles. So the whole idea behind this, Olmsted and Box, was to think of the city as being contained within a single park or a system of parks. The notion that anyone, no matter who you were, what your family background is, where you lived, you could have easy, walkable, bikeable, horsebackable access to a park-like environment. And guess what? All parks departments today are still trying to achieve that end in all of our cities. Go figure. And that's what they planned back then in the late 19th century in Buffalo. Now, here is, let's give you a couple of scenes. Delaware Park on the left, Front Park on the right, a huge park system, but a couple of scenes. Here are historic Lincoln Parkway with equestrian traffic on it, and modern day Bidwell Parkway on the right. You have parkways here. And the original idea for these parkways, folks, that it would be a big a linear green park in the middle of park-like streets. So really it was a multiple lane parkway with equestrian and foot traffic in the middle, et cetera. It's a little bit of a different way that we now see most of these parkways today as they exist in places like Buffalo, Louisville, New York City, which has a few, and so forth. But that was the original design, invented for the world here by Olmsted and Box in Buffalo. Now, right outside of Buffalo, if you have a chance to go up there, not a stone's throw really from Delaware Park, is the Richardson Olmsted complex in Buffalo. It started out life as the Buffalo Insane Asylum. By the way, it was completely restored. Architecture by H.H. Richardson, Richardsonian Romanesque. Landscape by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., all recently restored. Unfortunately, post-COVID, the Elegant Hotel and Restaurant is closed. Hopefully they'll reopen in the future, but you can still wander the grounds. There is interpretive signage for the landscape there. And it is a conference center and meeting site. So other things are going on there. Maybe in the future, there'll be yet another hotel and restaurant. It's a beautiful place. Now, wow, look at that. That's what Niagara Falls looked like. Now, there was a small section that was natural, that was open to the public, hidden behind a blind. You had to pay a commutation fee, as they called it, to walk up and over a blind to actually see a small section of Niagara Falls. The city fathers of Buffalo, after Olmsted, while he was working already on the parks, they said, Mr. Olmsted, how can you help us with this terribly desecrated, industrialized waterfall? Well, Olmsted, by the way, here are the rapids above Niagara Falls. Olmsted, I think I can. He organized the leading writers and intellects of the day, including some of the profound notables from around the world. He recruited quite a list of individuals to work with him, but Olmsted led the charge for the Free Niagara Association, sometimes called the Free Niagara Movement. And it was the first national campaign for scenic preservation in our nation's history. And it resulted in unparalleled legislation on the part of the legislature of the state of New York to create a brand new state reservation, the first state park in the nation. To tear down the industry, renaturalize the waterfalls, and protect them into perpetuity in the future. And they hired none other than Olmsted and Box to master plan this brand new state park. And their crown jewel is above the waterfall, folks. It's Goat Island. You got to go out to Goat Island. If you've never been there, above the waterfall complex, there's the Goat Island Bridge. Here is the bridge to the Three Sisters. Oh my goodness, go out there and you're going to have a radically different experience of the waterfalls than you typically do by seeing them from the more typical vantage points on either side, the US side or the Canadian side. It's stunning what they achieved there, by the way. And there's been a lot of restoration in recent years of the park and the surrounding parkways right there on behalf of New York State. Now, let's talk about John Charles Olmsted. I'm going to talk now about, here's the That's a new image. I just had it. Here it is, the American Falls, and the rapids are just up on the right there, and the bridge leads over those rapids up to the far right corner. But let's talk about this, the older brother now, John Charles Olmsted, also known as John C. Olmsted, sequentially nephew, stepson, and business partner of Frederick Law. As you know, Frederick again married his brother's widow and raised her children, and John Charles. And the young man learned his father's acute skills of reading the land, understanding soils and vegetation types, and he acquired his father's artistic skills as a draftsman and as landscape designer. He joined his stepfather's firm in 1875 after graduating from Yale. And before his father's retirement, he worked with his father on many projects, including the Back Bay Fens, the Biltmore Estate. Then as senior partner with the Olmsted Brothers firm, he led the Essex County, New Jersey project. By the way, the first countywide park system in the nation, renowned there in Essex County. This is in downtown Newark. Did you know that there's a gorgeous park called Branchbrook Park in downtown Newark? A park and parkway, it's quite extensive, famous for its cherry trees and blossom in spring. He also worked in Atlanta, Louisville, right here, and on the Chicago Park System projects. He left a huge mark in the Pacific Northwest where I currently live. He was invited out there, by the way, by the cities of Portland, Spokane, and Seattle. They de facto cost shared. And he saw scenes like this, Puget Sound. You can figure out what the scene is. Puget Sound, scenes like this in Seattle. There's Mount Rainier hovering in the background. And he wanted to incorporate vistas like this, in particular into his Seattle Park projects, but he did work in all three cities. Now, interestingly enough, this is how he left Boston. Very much the proper Bostonian, don't you think? He spent more and more time traveling by train back and forth to the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Spokane, and Seattle. And his entire image began to change. Look what happens when he moves from Boston to the Pacific Northwest. He becomes Sherlock Holmes. The only thing missing is the pipe. And you know, the funny thing is, ladies and gentlemen, I once moved from Boston to Portland, and despite the fact the way I'm dressed this evening, that's how I typically look in the wintertime in Portland. These things just happen to you. Maya knows, Layla knows something about this. Anyway, so now he did lay out the master plans for all these cities, but let me start with this. 1905, this is the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition that put Portland on the national map. Like father, like son, they all worked on World's Fairs. He also did the same thing, John C. Olmsted. Here is the AYP Exposition of 1909. This is an piece of art, right? This is a World's Fair. It's a folly, as all World's Fairs are. These buildings are going to be temporary, but not this. This is the Court of Honor. That's the Drumheller Fountain. A greatly exaggerated view of Mount Rainier. This becomes the centerpiece of the University of Washington, UW. Here's the campus center, the Drumheller Fountain, the Rainier Vista, and there, more accurately depicted in the photograph, is Mount Rainier. So the AYP exhibition becomes the modern day campus of the UW. Pretty cool, huh? Now, he worked on many projects there in Seattle. Doesn't this look like his father's map of Buffalo? Of course it does. 35 parks and parkways, all connected in Seattle, a very extensive park system, most of which are still there today. I could do a whole program just on Seattle. Here are about a couple of those. There's Volunteer Park. I like vintage images. There's Volunteer Park. Here's Green Lake. What a beauty. Here's the Washington Park Arboretum. And in my hometown of Portland, Oregon, not far from where I live, almost a neighborhood park, is what is considered the most picture-perfect Olmsted Park in the city of Portland, Laurelhurst Park. There's a bit of a nuanced story here that it's not actually designed by John C. Olmsted. It's designed by a student of his who became Portland's first park superintendent, who designed all of those parks in the Olmsted aesthetic. Now, also, John C. Olmsted, there's a big forest reserve in Portland still to this day. And in 1908 Portland Parks Report, John C. Olmsted said, hey, Portland Park Commissioners, there is this vast forest with old growth trees. You need to protect it, including its wildlife and its stream corridors. And maybe in the future, develop it as a wilderness amenity for the city of Portland, but don't develop it whatsoever, protect it. It's still protected to this day. We now know it as Forest Park. There it is, and this is the Willamette River Corridor. This is the St. John Suspension Bridge. This is downtown Portland here, folks. Forest Park, 5,200 acres, the second largest urban forest preserved in the United States. Where's the first, anyone? Anyone have any idea? I think it's right here. Isn't it called Jefferson Forest? Yes, Jefferson Forest is number one. Forest Park is number two. And by the way, it's filled with amenities like this. Here's Wildwood Trail. Look at that modern day bridge that was built in the Wildwood Trail. It is such a wonderful resource for the metropolitan area of Portland. By the way, it's a wildlife corridor. In the winter, herds of Roosevelt elk, black bear, and cougar are seen within miles of downtown Portland, thanks to the wildlife corridor in this park. Pretty cool, huh? Now, in order to talk about Junior, we kind of have to just introduce the whole idea of the City Beautiful movement. If time allowed, I would go deeper into the City Beautiful movement, but let me just say it really began in America with the World Columbian Exposition. And Lake Park in Milwaukee, by the way, is considered a City Beautiful era park. Here is building the City Beautiful, starting with this guy. Those of you who read Devil in the White City know about Daniel Burnham, famous for the expression, make no little plans. And boy, he was a big egoed character. And he brought in Frederick Law to help him design the famous White City, the landscape for the famous White City, which I'll return to a little later when I do the regional tour. The whole idea was to bring architecture, the finest in architecture, the finest in landscape design, and the finest in art. He recruited some of the finest artists of the day, visual artists, to create this stage set, a utopian fantasy, but to contrast sharply with the degraded urban conditions of the day, that planned development could create something like this if you bring the most brilliant minds of the day together all at once with a lot of money to cover their costs. But it did result in something interesting, the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C., which Frederick Law Jr. is very closely associated with. He was born on Staten Island, the son of Frederick Law Olmsted and Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, the natural son of that marriage. And from his earliest years, young Rick Olmsted was aware of his father's fervent desire to have him carry on both the family name and profession. He insisted that the son become far better educated in botany and horticulture. In the waning years of his life, the father included his son in the culminating projects of his own career. While still a student at Harvard, young Olmsted spent a summer working in Daniel Burnham's office as the White City of the Chicago World's Fair arose in Chicago. And after graduating in 1894, he spent a year on site at Biltmore, the 100,000-acre estate being developed for George Vanderbilt in Asheville, North Carolina. Here's an image of the gardens. And following his father's formal retirement in 1897, he became a full partner with his half-brother, John Charles, in the family business. If you're in Boston, if you want to explore the Olmsted legacy, and not just the Emerald Necklace, this is one of our new national park sites, National Historic Park. It was the family home, the family practice, the family business. The national park is there. The national park rangers, films, exhibits, tours, gardens, and archives and drafting rooms, just as they looked when the family practice was at its height. It's a very well worth visiting, by the way. And both sons together, by the way, John Charles and Jr., along with Beatrix Farrand, America's most noted early female landscape designer, among others, joined together to co-found the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architecture, the first professional association of its kind in America. Jr. helped found and taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the first professional program for landscape architecture in America, where he taught and influenced generations of landscape architects and urban planners, by the way. Now, Junior's, he emerged on the national scene in 1901 when he was appointed to the Commission of Fine Arts for the District of Columbia, more commonly known as the Macmillan Commission. Charged with interpreting for the 20th century Pierre Charles L'Enfant's visions of the nation's capital. And he worked to transform Washington into a work of civic art, along with his colleagues in that commission. And a partial listing of Junior's projects in the nation's capital reads like a guide to Washington, D.C., folks, including, I'm not going to picture all of them, including the National Mall, the Jefferson Memorial, Roosevelt Island, the National Cathedral grounds, the National Zoo, and the White House grounds, here indicated as the Executive Mansions, and Rock Creek Park. If you're working in the hothouse political atmosphere of DC and you need to escape, you go to Rock Creek Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and the Parkway, the entire park and Parkway, Jr., master planned. Speaking of the nation's capital, I do want to remind you that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. left his mark there. He did extensive landscaping work on the U.S. Capitol grounds, including reorienting the entrance and designing to the installation of the Capitol steps. I'm going to repeat that just once, folks, the Capitol steps. Remember, Olmsted Sr. saw all his public commissions as public spaces, where Americans would enact democracy. I'll leave it to you to mull over whether the events of a couple of years ago on the Capitol steps would have matched Olmsted's notions of American-style democracy. I apologize, but just think about that. Now, in August 2015, the National Park Service hosted a special event commemorating the 150th anniversary of Olmsted's historic report. Okay. Largely credited with providing the basis for the creation of Yosemite National Park. And this report, by the way, there it is. That's the report. It did create Yosemite. And you might remember that the National Park Service celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016. In fact, Olmsted Jr. wrote the language for the Organic Act of 1916, the creation of the National Park Service, like father, like son. And Jr. and the Olmsted brothers, for 30 years, they advised the National Park Service. And they were involved with landscaping efforts and master plans at numerous national parks across the nation, including Acadia National Park, Everglades National Park, Great Smoky Mountains, and Yosemite National Park, among others. Now, I'm going to take you out west very quickly. The Olmsted brothers were active throughout the American West, including the Denver Mountain Park system. There is Red Rocks Park. You ever hear of the Red Rocks Amphitheater? It's part of the Denver Mountain Park system, master planned by Jr. Olmsted Sr. in California. He designed the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland. Here it is today, the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland. Olmsted Sr. collaborated with Leland Stanford on the final architectural plan for Leland Stanford's private university. We now know it, of course, is Stanford. There's the chapel. Here's the Hoover Tower. Here's an aerial. It all holds together. It's considered a very cohesive university campus plan with its edifices and its landscape. And the Olmsted brothers came back in the 20th century, and they created a brand new regional park system for the San Francisco Bay Area. We now call it the East Bay Regional Park District, 65 parks in the East Bay area. It started with a smaller portfolio when Olmsted Jr. master planned it, but it's now 65. The Olmsted brothers, twice over, master planned the California State Park System, 125 state parks. And it resulted in the protection of the Santa Cruz Mountains, the redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which of course were some of which were badly impacted by recent fires. Also the protection of the largest state park, the desert state park in California, the Anza Borrego Desert. And later in the 20th century, they master planned the Palos Verdes. It's a long story, the largest residential project they ever worked on. Here it is today, Palos Verdes, California, all master planned by the Olmsted brothers. Back east, the father famously did Riverside, Illinois. And the son, Jr., followed in his footsteps with Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, Roland Park in Baltimore, and Mountain Lake Estates in Lake Wales, Florida. And see this here? This is Clock Tower Gardens in Lake Wales. What a jewel of a botanical garden that Jr. designed there in the highlands of north central Florida, about an hour south of Orlando. Now, here's, I'm going to not take time to drill down on this, but you should know, I just want to mention one thing. I'm going to a bunch of slides of Biltmore and the history there, the Olmsted history, which also led to Gifford Pinchot being hired as the first scientific forester in America, who made considerable improvements. And this forest would be considered, look at its degraded state. This is what Gifford Pinchot did. And then he hired a scientific forester, Carl Schenck. And this is where scientific forestry got its start in America, with the first forestry school, the Biltmore Forestry School. And it's now part of the Pisgah National Forest, which the family subsequently sold for a penny, if you will, to the national government. Well, they got more than a penny for it. But a great portion of that former estate is now part of the Pisgah National Forest. And we now know it as the cradle of forestry in America. And it's worth exploring that aspect of that legacy there, not just the Biltmore estate itself. Now, I'm going to zip through a bunch of these. We need to bring this to a close. Let's just say that there are extensive Olmsted landscapes all throughout the Midwest, from Milwaukee to Chicago, to the Chicago Park System is extraordinary. Riverside, Illinois, Riverside, the Old Fields, which is part of the New Fields Museum Complex in Indianapolis. That's Jr. The original house is Old Fields, but the complex today is referred to as New Fields. What an extraordinarily beautiful place this is in Indianapolis. How about Belle Isle in Detroit? And how about the Washington University in St. Louis? That's the brothers. There's the Danforth campus today, and Berea College. There it is, Berea, beg your pardon, I need to pronounce it correctly, but the Olmsted brothers did a lot of work for college, including Senior, did work for universities and colleges all across America, including Berea College. And what do you know? There's some parks here in Louisville too. I think you know that. So I'm not going to linger long on that. I want to actually end with a couple of quotes. Here's some images for you. You're going to recognize all of these images of your beautiful parks here. What an extraordinary park system it is. What an extraordinary jewel of a park system you have here, all continuously worked on for improvements and restorations by the Olmsted Park Conservancy. And small urban parks as well as the and parkways, of course. Here's but two of the parkways. And here is the Louisville Loop, City of Parks. Now I want to close with this. Three quotes, if you will. Perhaps we're going to let Daniel Burnham, the driving force for the World Columbian Exposition, close out this program. When the World's Fair was set to open in 1893 at a dinner with all the artists and architects gathered to laud Burnham for his achievements, Burnham himself pivoted and said this about his collaborator, Frederick Law Olmsted. Let's put up the John Singer Sargent famous canvas that's there at Biltmore of Olmsted. Each of you knows the name and genius of him who stands first in the heart and confidence of American artists, the creator of your own parks. He who it is who has been our best advisor and constant mentor. Frederick Law Olmsted, an artist. He paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. He should stand where I do tonight, not for the deeds of later years alone, but for what his brain hath wrought and his pen has taught for half a century. Inscribed in the terrace in an overlook at Cherokee Park, I was reminded of today, is a great quote. A great object of all the art of a park is to influence the mind through imagination. That's Olmsted. And finally, also on Olmsted's own words, the beauty of the park should be in the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together this way in pure air and under the light of heaven? Frederick Law Olmsted. It seems to me that that prescription, if you will, rings as loud today in 2022 as it did in the late 19th century. Thank you, Frederick Law Olmsted and Sons. And thanks to all of you for your time and attention today. Thanks for hosting me at this program, and I'll gladly take some questions.
So just as a reminder, if you do have a question, please come up to one of the microphones so that everyone, including our online audience, can hear you. While we wait, I'll go ahead and ask one. Park planners working today, designers, those creating new parks that continue to evolve. Do they also continue to draw from Olmsted's? Like, there are the people that are working in the Olmstedian, if I can coin a word, fashion?
That's you didn't just coin it. Others use that term, by the way. And it's a great term. Yes, absolutely. In fact, I had planned this as a part of my program, so I left it out for this very section. You happen to be very near such a park system right here. In fact, I'll have you know that when I present anywhere in the US, when that question arises, I point to several such projects. But the first place I point to is the parklands of Floyd's Fork. 21st century parks, parklands of Floyd's Fork. David Jones, and now Dan Jones, of course, whom some of you know. What amazing work has gone on there in its design and in its creation and its build out. And if you go to the website, many of you know this, at the get-go, it was inspired by Olmsted here in Louisville in particular, but it was inspired by the Olmsted legacy, by the Olmsted design conceit, the design philosophy from the get-go, and it manifests it in, I think, a pretty darn good way. Modern techniques, modern methods, different kind of landscaping. It's contemporary. It's not 19th century. It's not historic. But a lot of the same design principles, in particular the pastoral and the picturesque, are right there all throughout that linear park system. I've explored most of it. I've had the opportunity to meet. I met Mr. Jones when he was with us. I know Dan Jones, and they've done extraordinary work. And actually, it was WRT Planning and Design, from what I gathered, that did the master planning and the principal design work of that project. Now, just across the river, by the way, the Ohio River in Indiana, is another masterwork in progress. Now, I know the River Heritage Conservancy is there, formerly headed up by Scott Martin, now headed up by Susan Rademacher. Susan's not with us tonight, is she? But I gather there's a new name for it called Origins Park. Okay, I've only just learned that today. I'm a little behind the times. But what a transformation they're planning there. And I happen to know that one of the principal landscape architects of record for some of the original master planning is Laurie Olin, who I also personally know. And there's probably no living landscape architect in America. He's based in Philadelphia at Olin Studios. There's probably no living landscape architect in America who fully, I mean, he is Olmsted. It's extraordinary if you ever meet him. And he happens to be an Olmsted scholar, as well as a practicing landscape architect. And is doing extraordinary work all across America. You have been in some of his parks and landscapes wherever you've been across America. So it's right here, folks. There's probably no metropolitan area in America that has such a collection of historic legacy Olmsted parks and new manifestations of that same through line of design and artistry. It's really quite extraordinary. Hi.
I have a question about Calvert. I would pronounce it Bow, but you said Vaux.
Calvert Vaux. Yeah.
Vaux,
Yeah.
okay. My understanding was that he was really more the guy that made it all happen in Central Park, and that Olmsted was more the visionary. Is that true?
Yeah, you could. Well, Olmsted was also a very practical man, but
Okay.
Vaux recruited Olmsted to the task. He recruited Olmsted to the task. They both knew Downing. Downing had, by the way, Andrew Jackson Downing died young prematurely of a terrible steamboat accident on the Hudson. And Downing would have been the natural choice to be the architect the superintendent or the architect in chief for Central Park. But Downing's premature death provided an opening, if you will, an opportunity. And that's where Vaux and Olmsted entered the picture. And they both knew, actually, Olmsted had better connections with the civic leaders of the day and the glitterati, forgive the expression, the literary leaders and intellects of the day. And some of them literally lobbied for him for that role. So Olmsted and Vaux joined together in a partnership. They both had practical sides, but Vaux was the architect. He built things. He designed and built structure. So almost all of the structural elements that you see in Central Park, and there are many, not just bridges, but the palace and so on and so forth, everything there in the park, those were all Vaux additions. And then the landscaping, the earth moving, the landscape design, that's all Olmsted. But Vaux they both learned from one another. So in the rest of Olmsted's career, he actually designed hard structure too in various park systems in America, park projects that he worked on. And Vaux de facto became a landscape architect as well. So they collaborated in such a way until the end of their partnership when it dissolved. It dissolved twice. It dissolved before Niagara Falls. They came together at the end to work again at Niagara Falls, and then it dissolved again.
So that was my next question. Is what caused them to dissolve?
They had we actually detailed in our film to an extent. Olmsted was, I have to tell you, he was brilliant. And he was driven. And as many brilliant, driven people are, they're often very hard to collaborate with. They had a tempestuous relationship, they held each other in the highest of esteem, maybe like Lewis and Clark, but they had a challenged relationship some of the
Did
time.
Vaux go on to do other stuff?
No, he had done the Philadelphia Exposition. He did the original structure for the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the New York Museum of Natural History, the original buildings.
Okay.
And he was famous for those, but he had already done those, I think, by the time they even joined together on Central Park, or that was maybe simultaneous. I'd have to double check.
Like we lost him in his.
We have, and that's
Okay.
unfortunate, but I tell you, if you have a chance to see our film, we bring them back in our film.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay.
Laurence, thank you again so
Okay.
much. This has just been wonderful.
Thank you. I want to make just one closing comment.
Sure.
Let me just say that, and if I had more time, I would have drilled down this in greater detail. What have we just lived through, everyone? Terrible COVID crisis. We've also lived through a time where environmental and social justice are in the fore, including very much in my hometown and right here in Louisville. And the imperative is for us, for the parks world, not just the Olmsted world, the parks world, to create, design, program park spaces that are accessible and welcoming to all. And here's the key. That was Frederick Law Olmsted's agenda from the very start. And we're still trying to manifest that in America today. And this is what he and his sons bequeath to all of us, including this extraordinary park system here in Louisville. So thanks to the Filson Historical Society, thanks to the Olmsted Parks Conservancy, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to join all of you tonight.